Hello and welcome everybody to today's launch of the Australian Local Government Association's 2021 National State of the Assets Report. It's so great to have you all here with us today. My name's Linda Scott. I'm a councillor here in the City of Sydney Council and have the honour of being ALGA's National President. And so I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we meet on many different lands today of many different First Nations Australians. As I'm in Sydney, I'm here today on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. It's such an honour to be the National President of ALGA, of course, the federated organisation representing 537 local governments across Australia. And this report, just coming at the end of a year, but importantly, right in the lead up to a federal election, is a very timely reminder of the research that we have done to show the state of our local government infrastructure. I'd like to acknowledge and give a very warm welcome to the Federal Assistant Minister for Local Government, the Honourable Kevin Hogan MP. We're so grateful, Minister, for your time today. I'd also like to welcome and say we're very grateful too for the time of our other speakers, the Chief Executive Officer of Infrastructure Australia, Romilly, Madew, Fiona Simpson, who is of course the President of the National Farmers Federation, and our partner in this research, Myles, who is of course the President of the Institute of Public Works Engineering Australasia, or better known as IPWEA. I'd also like to extend a very warm welcome to all our ALGA board members, our mayors, councillors, local government staff and other attendees here today. We've had more than 200 people register for today's seminar. So thank you very much for showing such a strong interest in the state of local government infrastructure. We have a couple of very quick housekeeping items. This session will of course be recorded and it will be emailed to you afterwards or popped up on our website. And we do have a bit of time today after the presentations for some questions from the audience. So please do pop them into the Q&A function on your screen, as we'd love to do a shout out to you. Please let us know who you are and where you're from, but also your question. So those of you who've been in local government for some time will know that in 2019, the ALGA board commissioned IPWEA to update the 2018 National State of the Assets Report. I'd like to really acknowledge the great work of IPWEA and in particular their CEO, David Jenkins and Steve Lrci, Principal Advisor Asset Management, for the high quality report that has been provided to ALGA. Data was received from more than 450 councils, or 85% of all local governments. So this is an extremely good data set for those of you that are into research or researchers. Normally, this report would of course be launched at our National Roads and Transport Congress, but unfortunately, like so many activities that have been affected by COVID, this was not possible. And so we're really proud to be launching it today. The National State of the Assets Report is the latest in a series of research projects that have been commissioned by ALGA to monitor and assess how local governments are addressing the challenges of maintaining our infrastructure for the public good. This research will help everybody better understand whether our infrastructure is getting better, how it can be managed and improved, and of course, how local governments need more support through our state, territory and federal government funding streams, which are of course very important to us and the communities that we serve. The key finding for this year's research, and this is the critical one, 2/3 of all local government assets are in really good condition. So that's all our parks, our playgrounds, our water utilities, our roads, our bridges, our childcare, our aged care, so much different infrastructure that local governments own and run. Of course, that means that 1/3 are not in great condition. Specifically, nearly 1 in 10 of all local government bits of infrastructure need significant attention. and 3 in every 100 may need to be replaced. It highlights the gap between what local governments can spend on community infrastructure and what we need to spend to ensure our pools work, our childcare centres can stay open, and our roads and bridges are safe for people to drive on and for freight to be carried around. When local governments invest in public infrastructure, of course, we create great jobs that are vital to driving Australia's locally led economic recovery and ensuring that no community throughout the whole of Australia is left behind. We're really proud that local governments own and manage about 1/3 of Australia's community infrastructure: roads, cycle paths, parks, green spaces, bridges, libraries, community centres, sporting grounds. So many of those things that make a community are the bits of local government infrastructure that add to the public good. They provide every aspect of our day-to-day activities, keeping us safe, healthy and connected to our communities, and most importantly, keeping so many people across Australia employed. But after providing safer bike paths that keep people moving or recreational facilities that bring communities together, councils are also creating jobs, generating economic activity, and in doing so, enhancing community wellbeing in every corner of the nation. Maintaining infrastructure is just as important as building new infrastructure. And for those of you that are engineers or people who work in local government, I know you already know that, but it's a very important message that together we all need to communicate very clearly in the lead up to the federal election. If we don't maintain our pools, they can't stay open. It's so great to cut a ribbon on a new community library or a new park, but it's even more important to cut a ribbon on a reopened, maintained, safe pool or on a bridge that is safer for the future, having been built back better. We know, and this research highlights, the importance of continuous improvement in our systems to support our communities for the future, helping councils invest, for example, in asset management training, technology and software enhancements, skill development and information sharing. And I know many of our other speakers, including Romilly, I'm sure, will talk about that all-important aspect of skill development and how important it's going to be that we have enough trained, skilled people for the future. Replacing poor quality infrastructure is estimated to cost $51 billion. Replacing infrastructure in fair condition ranges from $106 billion to $138 billion. So we're not talking about insignificant funds. As communities adapt to our new physical, social and economic reality in a COVID world, we're not quite post-COVID yet, we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity to renew our public infrastructure, employ people to do so, and in the process, create a skilled economy that supports our nation's growth, productivity and future prosperity. Well-targeted infrastructure creates jobs and generates lasting economic, social and environmental benefit for all our communities. It lowers the cost for businesses and governments, connects workers to their jobs, and of course, plays a vital role in placemaking and community wellbeing. And local governments, as we all know, collect just 3.5% of Australia's taxation. So we know local governments need and welcome the support of other levels of government to achieve the outcomes we want. This research reinforces the need for the federal government to increase federal assistance grants, untied grants that we're grateful to receive from the Commonwealth, back to at least 1% of the total federal taxation revenue. It also reinforces the need to continue critical funding programs like Federal Roads to Recovery and the Bridges Renewal Program, and for additional targeted funding to be made available so that all our local governments and our communities can replace and renew essential assets that are no longer safe or no longer fit for the future. We're excited as the year comes to a close to prepare for the upcoming federal election, to work collaboratively with all state and territory and federal governments to ensure no Australian community is left behind, and together to invest in Australia's infrastructure and develop a more skilled workforce for our future. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce the Honourable Minister, Kevin Hogan. Kevin, or Minister more formally, took over the role as Assistant Minister for Local Government in July this year, and we were all very excited about that. We thank him for the really open access he's given ALGA over our many, many discussions. Since 2013, he's represented in the House of Representatives his electorate of Page in New South Wales for the National Party. He was born and bred in regional Australia, and he lives with his wife Karen and their 3 children on a beautiful property in Lismore. He's always been very committed to supporting his local community, and he's served on his local council wastewater advisory committee, so that gives him stacks of credibility. He's been the Vice President of his local primary school P&C, President of local sports club, and coached junior sport teams. So you can see he's a very committed community person, and we're lucky to have him as our Minister. Please join with me in welcoming Local Government Minister Kevin Hogan.
Wow, Linda, what an introduction. That's very kind of you. And just listening to you then, you know, and it's not even exhaustive, the list of assets that local governments look after, maintain, build, and as you expressed, the importance of maintaining that. Also, you've reminded me in that very generous introduction that, yeah, I mean, I actually literally got involved in more of public life through local council. That wastewater issue that you alluded to there was an exceptionally important issue for my very small community that of about 400 people about 10 or 13 years ago. But look, Linda, I acknowledge you and I acknowledge ALGA, the great work that you do. I thank you for commissioning this report. Interesting reading. There are certainly some challenges, some good news in there, but certainly some challenging things that we need to look out for going forward. You have, but I will acknowledge Myles as well, Romilly from Infrastructure Australia, and Fiona. I look forward to your contribution a bit later as well, Fiona. And more importantly, and I know we've got hundreds of people online, and I acknowledge all our local council representatives, especially our local mayors and staff, general managers, etc. Look, as Linda just said, I am from the north coast of New South Wales. I'm speaking to you. Would love, and when we do exit COVID completely, would love to obviously be at a public events where we can all get together and eyeball each other and speak and have sort of offline conversations, which I always find probably even as, if not more valuable than official presentations at things like this. But I look forward to that. But my electorate is North Coast. I'm speaking to you from my office in Lismore, which many of you would know where it is. If you don't, you might know where Byron Bay is, and we're about 45 minutes inland from there. Firstly, to the mayors, council staff, exceptionally, I really want to thank you. This has been a really different 18 months that we've had, and let's go back maybe even a couple of years. And if you told me, well, let's go back 3 years, if you were going to tell me 2.5 to 3 years ago how bad the drought was going to get for a lot of our country in 2019 and early parts of 2020, if you were going to tell me how bad the fires were going to be in many parts of this country in 19 going into 2020 as well, and then if you told me that we were going to follow that up with a pandemic that was going to be a worldwide pandemic, and then just to cap it off, many areas, I know Fiona's been personally affected by this, that we're then going to get hit by some flooding rains as well. So there's a poem about this, and ain't it the truth? But look, I want to thank you, because I think as a federal government, and I know the states would probably say the same, as a federal government, we've had a lot of work to do, and we've had a lot of things that we've needed to roll out, a lot of stimulus spending, whether it was bushfire funding, drought funding, COVID pandemic stimulus funding, and now indeed some flooding funding in certain areas, disaster funding there. We could not have done that. It would have been impossible for us to have done that without local governments, because you've not only helped us identify priority projects that you had and that were important for your communities, you indeed have been the most important partner that we have had in delivering these projects and getting literally bulldozers into the ground and things happening on the ground to deliver those projects. So I know this has been, for many of you, an exceptionally stressful process, and it's made it an exceptionally busy process for you. Look, just to go through, to what I was going to talk about, the main point of my address, I do just want to run through some of the infrastructure projects, as well as being the Assistant Minister for local government. I am also the Assistant Minister to the Deputy Prime Minister, and with that, he has an infrastructure portfolio. So I personally run, for example, the Lrci Recovery program, the Remote Airports Upgrade program, and now the Lrci Program. I'm responsible for that administratively. So, and let's start with that one, the Lrci Program. I think that I haven't met a local government official who hasn't loved that program, I think, as you know, we're running out, I think it's phase 3 of this, $1 billion that we announced in the previous budget. So I know that you're all going through that process again right now for that. So again, thank you for that. As I said, it's been important for identifying and all the programs we spoke about. You know, the Black Spot program, I just want to highlight that. Some councils have done some great projects with that. That's mainly the road project. I know we have Black Spot telecommunications, but many of you are involved in that as well. The Lrci Recovery Program, one of my favourites, started by John Anderson, a previous leader of our party, who just identified how important that program is. Administratively, I run that program. I want to thank you for the work you're doing in that. And I know there's good reporting happening now from you back to your federal MPs about the programs that have been delivered there. Bridge Renewal Program, again, a favourite of the Nats. We identified that coming into government in 2013. I know a particular council, to share some local knowledge for me, Hogan Council, ratepayer base of a few thousand. They had 300 bridges that were all decaying at the same time. Needed repairing at the same time, just did not have the capacity to do that. So that's been a really important program for us as well. Look, I note ALGA are a great advocate for you guys and local councils, and I note Linda's submission to lift the funding in FAG grants to the 1%. Look, I will certainly advocate for that as best I can and acknowledge the efforts she's doing. I will note, don't know if there's any state government people on board, but I will make the point, I think it's important, that FAG is the only untied funding that councils get. You don't get untied funding from state governments, you get it from us. So I just acknowledge that anomaly from state governments. And I know, to touch on it, with all the infrastructure programs that you're rolling out, we can always do more, we need to do more, we need to continue it. But I do note that given the record amounts almost of funding that we are giving, and I can include state government here, some of the tied funding that we're giving through some of the programs, that there has been a great skills and capability shortage. I was in a local government of my own about 2 or 3 months ago to announce another round of funding. That one was COVID stimulus. And they said, Kevin, we won't be doing this for 2 or 3 years, this project. It's just, we have so much on our work schedule with all the funding that we've been given that's going to take time. So I know Romilly's going to deal with that a bit as well. So another shortage. I mean, the infrastructure is important, but the skills and development issue that we have needs to be dealt with as well. And we've been doing things through National Cabinet with that as well. And just to touch on it, not necessarily related to this report today, I want to acknowledge to Linda today in another area. The vaccine rollout was obviously a really important government program for the country this year. We are now one of the top 2 or 3 vaccinated countries in the world. And Linda very much reached out to be part of that process with the Health Minister, which we facilitated at one stage as well. You guys have wonderful assets and wonderful resources. And in certain cases, it was important through your communication channels to liaise with communities that may not have been getting information through state or federal government sources. And I know that Linda played a role with the Health Minister to make sure some of you got involved with that process as well. So look, there's a lot on the agenda today, so I might leave it there. I know there's a question and answer session later, which obviously I'll be happy to be involved with. But again, thank you for all what you've done in what has been a very stressful time of our country in the last 2 years. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Minister. I know you probably can't hear it, but there's very loud applause from hundreds of people on mute right now for that speech. And I think particularly hearing, as we have heard from you before, that you really are our chief advocate in government and you're in there fighting for us. We're very grateful for that. So thank you very much for that really thoughtful, but also really supportive speech. It's now my pleasure to introduce to you Myles, who is, of course, the sort of chief architect with IPWEA of this research, and we're really grateful for that. Myles is a Chartered Fellow of Engineering New Zealand, and he was appointed to the IPWEA board in 2017 and has since served as the IPWEA New Zealand President, the Chair of NAMS Canada, and has more recently been appointed as the President of IPWEA Australasia. I can imagine that is quite the task. He's a very experienced and trusted infrastructure leader who understands the balance between stakeholder needs and commercial realities, a very tough balance. So welcome, Myles. Thanks so much for being with us, and thanks so much for the great work that IPWEA has done with us on this research.
Thank you, Linda. On behalf of IPWEA, it's a pleasure to be with you today. And I just want to acknowledge my other speakers today, so thank you. Look, it can't be said enough. Local infrastructure is the foundation of our community wellbeing. A community without safe, reliable water, road networks, and public spaces simply can't thrive. So IPWEA absolutely applaud the work that ALGA is doing in leading to tell the story of local infrastructure. And through this, its fourth investigation into the state of the assets. It's really great, as Linda pointed out, that you've got 85% of councils represented in this year's report. That's important because it ensures we're able to share the most complete picture of the nation's local government assets. Tracking the journey of local infrastructure over the years is a really important service to the people of Australia. This is because well-run public infrastructure is essential to support the well-being of communities over many generations. As a technical society of engineers Australia, IPWEA have a long and proud history of supporting public works engineers throughout their careers. We're focused on helping public works and asset management professionals to provide the essential infrastructure services to their towns and their communities. It's been through ALGA's leadership that we can progressively measure that we're actually making a difference, that we are building safer and more reliable and efficient roads, that we are building more resilient water systems, that we are actually building cultural and recreational facilities that meet the needs of our communities. And this year's report shows that local government is doing a great job in maintaining and building infrastructure and making it more resilient to natural disasters. As Linda pointed out, the report mentions that 2/3 of the infrastructure is in a good condition. However, the report this year did reveal that 10% of local government infrastructure assets are in a poor condition. Look, this isn't out of line with other levels in other first world countries. Infrastructure assets do have a natural life cycle. They are new, they get used, they age, and they deteriorate with time. As such, it's completely reasonable to expect that a small proportion of the asset base will be in poor condition all of the time. And this is why asset management plans are so important. It wouldn't necessarily make sense to replace public assets that are still in good condition and still have plenty of life. But what is important is that the proportion of those assets in a poor condition isn't increasing with time. That is, that we have the funding and the planning in place to replace or refurbish those assets as those assets and those communities require it. And this year's report shows that this is the case as we look back to the results of the 2015 report. It's also important to note that as your asset base grows, so will the number of assets that are in a poor condition, increasing the scale of the renewals workload, making asset management plans even more important. This year's report shines the light on the 6.4% growth in assets over the reporting period. That is a really high level of growth in assets. Having the funding for building the infrastructure is half the story, but having the funding to also train and to help people build a career in delivering infrastructure through planning and maintenance helps us complete that picture. Also, it's important that the levels of investment in new assets and the investment in asset management over the decades needs to be aligned. You wouldn't buy a new car and then not have the money to service it. New assets bring benefits, but they also require planned maintenance. The major caution in the report this year is what looks to be an increasing skills shortage impacting the capacity of the workforce. Now look, skills shortages are predicted to impact a number of high-skilled sectors around the world over the coming years. And look, public infrastructure is going to be no different to this. The report correctly identifies the need for local government to be sufficiently resourced, to have the local capacity to provide a sustainable workforce to the ongoing planning, operations, and maintenance activities of local infrastructure is critical to community well-being and a strong local economy. There are over 500 local councils in Australia, and 2/3 of those councils service populations of less than 30,000 people. It's therefore critical that we can build local asset management capacity through investment activities such as asset management plan training, technology, and information sharing. One technology is the systematic development of asset management plans. It was surprising to read that 1/3 of the councils don't have current asset management plans for their major assets. This asset management plan development technology is cheap, and it exists now in Australia through the NAMS Plus platform, which was used for the survey. The Canadian federal government has supported NAMS Plus asset management plans into the local councils throughout Canada over the last few years. The trusted custodianship required of public infrastructure asset managers and operators is a never-ending task spanning multiple generations, and it is just simply not a case of set and forget. A scalable and consistent approach is needed so that all levels of government, including the small and rural communities, can work under a common framework of sustainable infrastructure delivery and management. To that end, I suggest that the federal and state government's interest in support in the maintenance of replacement of these essential local assets needs to change. Government often recognise and provide support for the capital build, which is highly valued by our communities. But then local government must rely on their own source revenues to manage these assets over the long term. Recently, the New Zealand federal government acknowledged it has a greater role to play in supporting the provision of local council water supplies across the generations. I encourage the Australian federal and state governments to keep an eye on the changes in local infrastructure management around the world, in particular across the Tasman and into Canada and other countries of comparison. Ensuring a sustainable funding pipeline in support of both assets and growing skilled people is key to achieving Infrastructure Australia's goal of a sustainable, resilient infrastructure that improves the quality of life for all Australians. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Myles. And it was a really great presentation, a great piece of research, but thanks also for bringing that really important international perspective to our considerations of local infrastructure. We know how important that is. So on infrastructure, it's my pleasure now to introduce a very good friend of ALGA, Romilly. Romilly is, of course, very well known to everybody in ALGA because she's such a great presenter at our National General Assembly this year and communicates on a range of common issues with those of us in local government. Romilly was appointed the Chief Executive Officer in early 2019 of Infrastructure Australia, and she's responsible for overseeing Infrastructure Australia's critical role in helping government prioritise projects and reforms that best serve our communities. And I know she's got a particular passion for local infrastructure, which is why we love having her there. Before joining Infrastructure Australia, she was the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia for 13 years, and in acknowledgement of her contribution to Australia's sustainable building movement, she was awarded an Order of Australia in 2019. Very welcome, Romilly. Thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks so much, Linda, and good afternoon. And thank you very much, ALGA, for having me to speak. I'm dialing in from Ku-ring-gai land here on the Northern Beaches, which is the land of the saltwater people. And I too pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I also would like to acknowledge the other speakers today, the Honourable Kevin Hogan, Fiona Simpson, President of National Farmers Federation, and Myles, what a fantastic statistics and information you were just giving us. We work very closely with IPWEA as well as we work closely with NFF. Very quickly, because Linda started talking about market capacity, grab some statistics, which I am going to rattle off in a minute. I think it's important that you all appreciate some of the research we've just undertaken and what we all need to be quite cognizant of. And we were having a great briefing this week with ALGA regarding that. So just to remind you, Infrastructure Australia is the nation's infrastructure advisor, and we sit within the Department of Infrastructure, Transport, Regional Development and Communications. We sit alongside government with a mandate to provide evidence-based analysis and advice on reform and investment priorities needed to deliver better infrastructure for all Australians. And I repeat, for all Australians, because we take a geographic view of infrastructure across the whole of Australia, from both our urban fast-growing centres to regional cities and to remote rural and regional and northern Australia. Despite our national remit, we are highly attuned to the important role of local governments and their role that they play in providing many essential services. We also appreciate that local governments provide a vital connection to our communities at the ground level. Obviously, I'm here on the Northern Beaches, and I work very closely in a number of other relationships, including surf lifesaving, with the Northern Beaches Council. Meaning that we at Infrastructure Australia know that local governments often have an intimate understanding of their community's unique challenges and opportunities. I'm just going to touch on market capacity very quickly before I go into challenges and opportunities. So Linda mentioned our infrastructure market capacity report that we released recently. We were asked to do this report by COVID in the early 2020, and the research provides a new level of visibility on how market constraints can impact on major public infrastructure pipeline. All the information I'm about to mention is on our website under the Market Capacity Project, and there's a number of dashboards, diagnostic tools and research papers. As you're all aware, the Australian government has undertaken a historic $110 billion rolling spend over 10 years. While this investment is substantial, it represents only 1 in 10 infrastructure dollars. States and territories have committed the lion's share alongside private sector investors. However, major public infrastructure activity will double over the next 3 years, peaking at $52 billion in 2023. You must remember that major public infrastructure is only 20% of the overall infrastructure spend. So I've just said to you, of the 20%, 52 billion of that is to be delivered by 2023. That includes approximately 434 projects worth 218 billion will be completed by 2025. 39% of all mega projects will be located within 5 kilometres of another mega project, remembering that mega projects are over $1 billion. And this creates local supply constraints and puts pressure on the labour market nationally. The transport sector, mostly road and rail, will dominate demand. 4 out of $5 are allocated to transport projects over the next 5 years. High propensity to run over cost is 75%. This is based on international figures. Our report also shows a 75% growth in demand for skills, 120% growth in demand for materials, and this is driven by bluestone, demand for bluestone, 125% growth in demand for equipment, and that's driven by demand in control equipment, and 140% growth in demand for plant, and that's driven by specialty equipment. In mid-2023, potential shortfall in infrastructure jobs being filled is forecast to exceed 105,000, with 1 in 3 jobs advertised going unfulfilled. This presents an opportunity for further employment, but there is also a risk these labour shortages will impact project delivery. So I'll leave it at that. All the information is on our website. So looking at infrastructure challenges facing local government. We also appreciate that many local governments face challenges relating to the maintenance and operation of their diverse infrastructure assets. We picked this up in our 2020-19 audit. We also talk about it in this year's plan, and we also have proposals in our infrastructure priority list as well, specifically looking at asset management. Local governments often have modest budgets and relatively small revenue bases, meaning they can struggle to meet the cost of maintaining their assets. As outlined in the 2021 State of the Assets report, there is a gap between what local governments can spend on infrastructure assets and what is needed to effectively maintain them. Local governments can also be reliant on federal and state government grants, as you well know, which are generally for new projects and do not include ongoing funding for maintenance, meaning that while a grant may be welcomed in the short term, it can actually increase the cost burden on local governments in the long term. Without addressing existing practices, local governments will struggle to be able to provide the infrastructure and services our community need to prosper. We need to explore new approaches to ensure local governments have more of a say in how infrastructure is planned and delivered in their communities. And as Linda mentioned, we do have a federal election coming up, so this is the opportunity to raise your ideas and input. Infrastructure Australia believes that local communities and local governments need to have more of a say about the kind of places they want to live in. Involving local communities not only builds trust in institutions, but also harnesses local communities' knowledge. Governments need to recognise that we can approach infrastructure planning using we can't approach infrastructure planning using a one-size-fits-all approach. We need to adopt approaches that recognise and respond to the innate characteristics of our settlements. Place-based planning provides a mechanism to help governments achieve this. I'm going to leave it on place-based planning because I'm conscious of time and I stole a bit of my time talking about market capacity. So I'll leave it there because I'm sure that I'll get lots of questions coming up. But one thing I just want to finish off with is a more collaborative approach between all levels of government is critical to ensure long-term place-based infrastructure outcomes are delivered for local communities. And we consistently call this out in all our policy work. And I know ALGA are very aware of that because we've worked very closely with them all. This collaborative approach will help ensure that communities are provided with the assets and services needed to support productive, healthy and happy places. We remain committed to supporting government and industry with this task. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Romilly. And look, you can see there why ALGA is so proud to have such a strong relationship with Infrastructure Australia. Romilly should really take very much credit for the fact that we are starting to see those local government priorities coming up in the National Infrastructure Australia list. So that's a great thing for local governments, a great recognition for how important local infrastructure is for the national set of infrastructure priorities, but also gives councils, of course, a great avenue through which to put your projects on the national agenda. So if you haven't got a project ready for Romilly's National Infrastructure Project, then get that ready. Our final speaker is, of course, the amazing Fiona Simpson, who is the President of the National Farmers Federation. In 2016, Fiona became the first female president of the National Farmers Federation in its 37-year history. She's previously served as the National Farmers Federation as Vice President for 2 years and as a Director since 2011. She was also the first female president of the New South Wales Farmers Federation, retaining that position for a full 4-year term from 2011 to 2015. She's a farmer from beautiful Liverpool Plains, a place which I know very well and love. And she and her husband, Ed, and her family run a mixed farming enterprise, including broadacre farming and breeding commercial poll Hereford cattle. Fiona, it's a great pleasure to be partnering with you in this national conversation about the importance of infrastructure. We're enormous fans of the work that the National Farmers do under your leadership. So thank you very much for being here and very welcome.
Thanks so much, Linda, and thanks for having me along. Kevin Hogan, Romilly, Madew, ladies and gentlemen, it's great to be with you today and talking about something that I am just so passionate about. So what my bio didn't say, and they always go on a bit, don't they? But what they didn't say was that why I have such a soft spot for local government. And that is because my father-in-law was the mayor of then Corindi Council, which is now Liverpool Plains, I think for about 12 years. years. And in 2008 to 2012, I also served a term on Liverpool Plains Council and absolutely loved my time in local government. The main reason that I actually didn't stand again was because it required me being in Corindi personally on a Wednesday evening twice 2 weeks in the month, and I just, with my other responsibilities, just couldn't manage that personal attendance. So otherwise, a huge supporter of local government and a huge supporter of all that you do, and was able to get a little shout out to you all on the drum last night, where one of the topics was the reform of the Federation, and Dominic Perrottet's views about that from a state government perspective, and just that he managed to forget to mention that there was actually a third tier of government as well, which if you're talking about grassroots and reform from the grassroots, I think you might say that local government is probably better placed to deliver that than anyone else. However, coming to you from my farm today on the Liverpool Plains, as Linda said, great to be here. It's beautiful Gomeroi country, and really very privileged to have known some of their elders, both present and past, and pay my respects to emerging leaders in this community too. I'm really pleased today to just talk a little bit about NFF in this really important discussion, and also some of our policy priorities. As Linda said, heading into a federal election, it's a really important time for us to all be working together on some of the things that are really important to us and to our communities. And certainly at the NFF, we do have a strong affinity with the challenges and opportunities facing ALGA, its members and regional local councils. Both the NFF and ALGA are national representatives for memberships that span across every state, every jurisdiction, and encompass every regional and rural community in Australia. That's a pretty heavy task. Some of our farmer members are actually representatives and involved in local government too. So we do have a really strong affinity with you. As the closest and most visible level of government, farming communities rely on local governments for the provision of community services, social and economic infrastructure. And this intersection of membership that we have with you has created an absolute alignment on a host of policy and advocacy priorities for the agriculture and regional local government sector. And we're really delighted to be working closely in this space, as we are with Romilly, Infrastructure Australia, and government for that matter, to try and get better outcomes and good outcomes for people in rural and regional communities across Australia. We were pleased to note and really welcome the appointment of Tamworth Mayor Col Murray. Oh, he's just stepped down as Infrastructure Australia Chair. We call that appointment visionary, inspired, I think, and it's so exciting to see a regional person in that appointment, giving regional infrastructure a national focus. The challenges facing local government, particularly regional local councils, should just not be underestimated. There's a significant gap opening up between the demands for more infrastructure, infrastructure maintenance and services provision, and the revenues that local governments can raise through rates. In some regional councils, and I'm not telling you anything here, the dwindling population base and the pegged rating systems means that there's absolutely no chance that councils can financially deal with the infrastructure and service provision tasks expected of them. And throw on top of that an emergency like the floods that we've had in my neck of the woods over the last few weeks, and it's a Herculean task that it's hard to see your way through. I think it's important to recognise and highlight, as the report does, that local government manages over $350 billion of hard infrastructure collectively. Just the maintenance costs associated alone would be astounding for most people. And it's always not very surprising, but it is alarming to read that 36% of local government infrastructure assets were in poor to fair condition. With my NRMA hat on, we're constantly highlighting the shortfall in maintenance for local road infrastructure in New South Wales alone. And that figure always astounds me too. From a farm business perspective, we're totally reliant on the quality of road and freight networks to get our goods to market affordably and reliably, and the first and last miles of these journeys wholly undertaken on local government infrastructure. So it's critical that that's up to the task and is funded, and that you, as often the service delivery agents, are properly funded to complete that task. In terms of our policy priorities, and again, we're sharpening these up in terms of the coming election, and really delighted to be working with LGA on some of these. We have a really ambitious agenda for regional development, and we launched our regionalisation agenda some time ago now, and have just been building it ever since. Our vision is one that is shared by all levels of government, that is effective and sustainable regionalisation. We ditched the term decentralisation some time ago, and most absolutely, wholeheartedly embrace the term regionalisation. The disruptions in our urban centres and our industries, and the outsized role of regional industries in our economic growth, has given us a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get regional development right. We are throwing our support behind a national approach to regional development, and we believe that National Cabinet should work with local governments to establish the framework on this. Local governments are, by definition, absolutely at the heart of any regionalisation agenda. We need them to be resourced so they can provide superior local roads, infrastructure, freight transport routes. We need properly resourced local governments to have the professional staff to make considered and quick decisions on heavy vehicle access. Growing grain that can't easily get to market is not a good business case for any farmer. We also need our regional councils to have the resources to put on regional development expertise, to make the business cases to put the business cases forward for transformational regional infrastructure and investments, so that regional areas get their fair share of the national infrastructure spend. We need long-term funding and resourcing of the local government sector by state and federal governments to ensure that all these vital community and economic foundations are laid out, noting that local governments simply don't have the revenue-raising power to do it by themselves. And I'll finish by saying that we will have more to say on this in February 22, when we launch the next iteration of our regional development precincts discussion paper, which is the next step in our regionalisation agenda. And again, really delighted and pleased to talk to you more about it, and to make sure that we can gain your support in some of the vision that we have, and how to implement some of the vision that we have in terms of strong regional areas in Australia. Thanks so much, Linda.
Thanks so much, Fiona. What a great presentation. And you can see why together ALGA and the National Farmers Federation already have so much in common, and are going to be really strong partners going forward. And Fiona, whenever you do mention local government on your regular appearances on the drum, I can tell you my phone blows up, because everybody starts texting me and saying, how great is Fiona? She's doing a great job advocating for local government. So thank you very much. We're so grateful you've had that magnificent local government experience, and you bring it to the table in your current national role. Congratulations, and we're so looking forward to working with you more. We do thankfully just have a couple of minutes for questions. So whether you're going to put your questions into the chat or the Q&A, I know there's two boxes there. Please do go ahead and pop your name and where you're from, which council or which part of Australia, and in what capacity you're here, and then any questions, and we hope we can go to our speakers to ask a few of them. I already see we've had a request, which is just music to my ears, to include in the roads section footpaths and cycleways. Hallelujah. Great piece of feedback there, so thank you very much. And we do have a couple of questions. We do have some questions, for example, from John Comrie. Hello, John. Thanks for popping a question in. You've asked us, how accurate do you believe the report is in giving us a snapshot of Australia's local government infrastructure? So I might go to Myles for that, given IPWEA have really authored so much of this report, and he can speak a little bit, as he's already done, about the methodology and how representative this might be.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. Obviously, we're sourcing information from all the way around the country with people with different time and different systems of how they record information. I think it's good. I think there's more we can do, but the fact that we've got 85 councils represented gives you a pretty good start. And generally, people are pretty honest about what they're doing. Look, there's more we can do, but for the purposes of this report, for the fourth generation, I think it's really good. I think it's and we can go from strength to strength from here.
Thank you. And as a former researcher in another life, I can tell you that an 85% response rate is pretty unusual. So yeah, I'd be pretty happy with that as a statistically good sample. The next question is about, in terms of investment, where do we think we should be spending most on assets going forward? Now, I'm going to go to Kevin Hogan on this one. Where should we be focused on? And Romilly then to sort of touch on that one as well. And Fiona, I'm sure you'll lean in on that one. Where should we be focusing our investment?
Well, yeah, everywhere. I mean, just given the list that you gave at the start, Linda, about what local governments look after and responsible for, the list is huge and varies across all levels of our life in the communities that we live in. But look, I can tell you, I put out a lot of surveys. I do at least one major survey a year, and as I'm obviously a federal MP, people would, I perceive, would look at federal issues. I can tell you the number one issue that we get surveyed, when we put out a survey, the number one issue that people come back with on everything we do is local roads. So it doesn't matter what time of the year, what year it is, that's, that seems to be the number one focus for people. So, that's probably, I'm sure, the feedback a lot of you get, but local roads are important. But having said that, as I said, everything local governments are responsible for important in our lives, the pools, the childcare centres, everything. So it's a big job.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. Romilly.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to pick up a point that both Kevin made and Myles made. Everything is important, but what is more important is having the data to be able to analyse what's important and highlight and prioritise what's important. I can't stress enough, it's now the use of technology and the collection of data that is helping us then make the case for where investment should be spent. And so this is where local governments working together, don't reinvent the wheel. There's a lot of data analytics that have been developed. Universities are spending a lot of time on this. My son's actually doing a master's in it. But it's collect the data, because it makes your argument so much easier when you can prove where you need to be spending the money and where you need that money.
Thank you. And that's a great tip for us all, isn't it? To, make sure we're all making very evidence-based arguments. And a big part of the recommendation of this research is to invest in those software systems, skilled staff, to make sure that we're collecting all that information on a very systematic basis to make those very evidence-based arguments. Fiona, what's your pitch about what the priority should be?
I think, look, I agree with what everybody said. I have to say I'm a really big advocate, and I think during my time at New South Wales Farmers, I was able to sit on the Infrastructure New South Wales committee that looked at some of the allocation of funding around resources for regions and also for road infrastructure. And we saw firsthand the difference that, and I think you commented on it initially, Linda, when you talked about maintaining as well as opening new things, because there are, particularly when it comes to roads, just miles, kilometres and kilometres and kilometres now of roads that are really strategic routes, not just for one council, but also for a number of councils when we're talking about establishing regions and hubs and growth centres and all of those things. So I think, if I could say anything, I think it's encouraging councils, yes, to focus and to have a really clear view. I agree with Romilly on the data around what is, what are the needs in their particular council, but also to work together in terms of increasing the bang for buck in some of these strategic assets that actually join councils together and make it easier for freight and for people to move around and to perhaps, maybe not just wholly within your own shire, but really strategic routes, because I think in regional Australia, we see so many routes that are not national highways and not, state highways, but incredibly important routes that are just crying out for funding.
Yeah, great answer. Thank you. We have another question from Nanditi Metpa, who said, with all the funding being made available for local government infrastructure projects for the benefit of communities, how can it be ensured that it's built to the right standard so that the state of local assets are maintained? And I think this is a great question, because all of us have seen that road built to a adequate standard washed away by floodwaters, built back to an adequate standard, and washed away the very next year by floodwaters. How do we ensure that this very often spoken about Build Back Better agenda is actually implemented in sort of funding to local governments, and then local governments do actually build back better? Romilly's put her hand up first. Romilly.
That's a great question. We did some work with Infrastructure New South Wales, and Fiona's mentioned Infrastructure New South Wales. So if you look on either one of our websites on Pathway to Infrastructure Resilience, we talk about the importance of, with our assets, both as asset managers, how in the planning phase we think about those assets. So we used to think about the Princess Highway of, that was how we got to the South Coast to go on our holidays. Now we see the Princess Highway as an evacuation route when there is a bushfire on. We've completely pivoted the way that we're looking at our assets now with the resilience lens. We're working really closely with the Federal National Recovery and Resilience Authority. I think it's NRRA that Shane Stone runs. And then obviously you've got Shane Fitzsimmons in New South Wales and the Resilience New South Wales. So it's right up front. It's got to be planned right up front, the resilience of all our assets. And again, when we look at the bushfires, when our electricity went down, we lost our telecommunications towers. And I'm sure many of you had some terrible experiences during those times. So it's understanding our critical infrastructure and then how we're protecting it and how we're reviewing it differently. And I think now that when we use that Princess Highway analogy to people, they go, oh yeah, I hadn't even thought of it that way. So we've got to think about our infrastructure differently. We are having more and more of these events and they're costing us more and more money.
It really is a great example, isn't it? I'll never forget, as a former SES volunteer in a past life, going in to help clean up bushfires just with enormous black spots. No one could talk to each other or communicate in the recovery process of an emergency, let alone in the acute phase of an emergency. And suddenly you realise that thinking about infrastructure from a resilience perspective is so important and gives you a totally different lens on what's important to prioritise. We've got 2 minutes left. So Fiona and Myles, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds and then we need to wrap up. Fiona first. Now, we just got you on mute, Fiona, but we've all been there.
You have. I should have been over it by now. Look, I just think too, we have to, again, I think we see such difference when we're talking about Build Back Better. Let's, let's open our eyes widely. I was always told, if you want a Lamington, ask for the cake shop. But I think by actually, really looking at the skills and the expertise, as you've done, to see what sort of expertise we need to build those roads back better and properly costing them out, and have, really, when we're talking to federal and state governments, have that attitude that we want to build a piece of infrastructure that's going to last and it's going to be whatever, and cost that properly, and then it might actually lift it up to a level where it becomes one of those projects that Romilly's talking about, with significant long-term benefits to the region and to the state and to the nation. So I tend to think sometimes we just make do too much and try and stretch our dollar further at our own expense.
Thank you.
Look, just picking up on that. I think the fundamental thing we can do is asset management plans, because it gives us the template to signal that investment and actually have those conversations with our communities and our elected members and give ourselves the time to respond. But fundamentally, the other thing it does is it gives us the opportunity to look across councils and go, hey, you've got one of those, we've got one of those, can we procure it together? And then we can make our dollars go further. So I can't push enough for asset management plans, sorry.
Great tip. No, thank you, Myles. It's a really important point. And all those state associations out there, a number of those state local government associations have procurement bodies and they can help do these things collaboratively. There's smarter ways to do these than just individual procurement of individual plans. Thank you. As we reach the end of our time, I'm so grateful to you all for spending time with our many, many people online today. For those of you that have not already, you can download the report in the links in the chat, and please do that and share it with your local governments and with your community. It's been a great conversation today, and I think we've all really benefited from that. Some of the discussions, of course, will continue at our National General Assembly in June 2022. And we urge all of you, particularly our mayors and councillors, to make sure you're joining us in Canberra, hopefully in person. We're very confident we will be able to be in Canberra next June for our annual General Assembly. And it's a chance, of course, to get those motions in and help determine ALGA's policy for the future on infrastructure matters and all else important. You'll get a copy of this webinar with direct link to download the summary and full report in case you've missed it. And you can ensure you're sharing that on social media. Please do. Hashtag NSOTA21. Hashtag NSOTA21. So ALGA will soon, on behalf of all local governments, be proud to be releasing our federal election priorities. They include, of course, calling on governments, oppositions and crossbenchers a commitment to return to 1% of federal assistance grants via a phased approach. $500 million per annum for a 4-year continuation of the local roads and community infrastructure program. And you've heard already from Minister Kevin Hogan how much love we have for that federal funding. A strategic local roads investment program of $300 million per annum over 4 years. And of course, an increase to roads to recovery to $800 million per annum and black spot funding as well. We need your voices to be heard. We know many of you are meeting with ministers, meeting with your local MPs and putting forward your local examples of what might be funded under these programs. And so thank you to those mayors and councillors who've already resolved to ask for a range of these federal government programs and met with your local MPs and local candidates to ask for these things. We look forward to every mayor and every councillor doing that in the lead. Because we know together our voices are very strong. Thank you again for coming today, and we look forward to working with you all more in the lead up to the forthcoming federal election. Happy Christmas, happy New Year, happy end of what has been a very, very difficult year for so many of us, and I hope everybody stays safe over the storm flood season. Thanks everybody, and see you all soon.